Space is one of the most abused words in adult relationships. It sounds harmless, almost noble, reflective, mature. It suggests someone is trying not to act impulsively, trying not to say or do something final before they understand themselves more honestly. That is the flattering version of it. But in real life, space often means something much less honorable. It means distance without responsibility. It means freedom subsidized by the person being distanced from. It means, very often, I want to begin leaving before I have to admit I'm already gone. The lie is not always in the separation itself. The lie is in the moral language wrapped around it. People ask for space when they want to sound uncertain. They move in with someone else when the uncertainty was never real. I learned that in the final year of my marriage, though I should have understood it sooner. For too long, I believed calm men had some protection against being fooled in ordinary, humiliating ways. I thought if a man paid attention, if he stayed emotionally restrained, if he refused to make accusations out of fear, then eventually the truth would arrive before the damage became structural. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means more dangerous. I believed that because I was patient, the people closest to me would know the difference between patience and weakness without needing it explained. They don't. Not always. Especially not when their own comfort begins depending on that confusion. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and until a little over a year ago, I had been married for 15 years to a man named Gavin. We lived outside Nashville, in one of those neighborhoods full of careful stonework, wide kitchen islands, and quiet financial performance. The kind of place where everything looks settled enough that no one asks very many questions unless someone starts moving out in daylight. We had no children. That fact mattered in the end, though not for the sentimental reasons people expect. It meant there were fewer visible obligations binding us together, fewer practical barriers slowing down emotional selfishness once it decided it wanted a cleaner script than the truth would allow. I worked in operational compliance for a healthcare procurement firm, which meant process discipline, vendor risk, documentation, timing, the thousand dull, load-bearing things that keep more charismatic people from making very expensive mistakes. I liked that kind of work because it rewarded accuracy more than mood. If something was unstable, it showed. If a system depended too much on one person's confidence, it eventually exposed itself under pressure. Reality in that world had rules. That was comforting to me. At home, I was slower than I should have been to apply the same logic, because love makes honorable people less suspicious than prudence requires. Gavin worked in luxury property marketing. He was good at the kind of social ease that makes people assume emotional intelligence before they've seen any evidence of character. Bright smile, quick charm, selective attentiveness. He knew how to make strangers feel recognized and rooms feel lighter just by moving through them. When we met, I found that compelling. I was quieter, more deliberate, less interested in atmosphere for its own sake. He brought movement. I brought steadiness. That is the story many couples tell early on, and for a while it was true enough to feel like a foundation. I do not want to flatten our marriage into fraud from the beginning. That would be easier on my pride than the truth deserves. There had been real love. We built a house. Buried parents, made it through leaner years, helped each other through health scares, job transitions, and the kind of ordinary emotional weather that turns romantic attachment into something heavier and more consequential than chemistry. We had private jokes, rituals, habits of care. We had the everyday tenderness that only grows in long relationships when both people still believe loyalty is part of their identity. That matters, because the most serious betrayals do not begin in false relationships. They begin in real ones that gradually become morally unrecognizable. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should say something that does not make me look wise. I took too much pride in being reliable. Not the loud kind of pride. The inward kind men often mistake for virtue because it does not call attention to itself. I handled the mortgage, the insurance, the emergency fund, the tax folders, the retirement transfers, the contractor schedules, the car servicing, the endless administrative background that makes adult life feel ordinary instead of fragile. I did it because I was good at it and because someone needed to. But there is danger in being quietly indispensable. If another person is careless enough, they stop seeing your stability as love and start treating it as climate. Once that happens, they begin imagining themselves more independent than they really are, because your effort has become invisible. Gavin used to call me grounding. Later, he called me safe. In the last years, that shifted toward language that sounded more polished and therefore took longer to recognize as contempt. I was structured. A little too settled. Hard to move. Those phrases matter because contempt rarely begins with insults. It begins with hierarchy disguised as observation. Once one partner starts seeing the other's steadiness as a smaller form of life, betrayal stops feeling like betrayal in the betrayer's own mind. It starts feeling like self-discovery. The first serious change in our marriage was not another person. It was asymmetry. Gavin began behaving as though his dissatisfaction carried greater moral depth than my concern. If he felt boxed in, that was meaningful. If I felt unsettled, that was anxiety. If he needed room, that was healthy. If I asked for clarity, that was pressure. He started speaking in the language people often use when they are trying to turn appetite into philosophy. He talked about needing breathing room, about how some people confuse closeness with ownership, about not wanting to perform partnership when he felt inwardly divided. None of those ideas are inherently false. That is why they are so effective when used dishonestly. Selfish people love real words. They just relocate them into structures that serve appetite rather than truth. I should have recognized that earlier. I didn't, partly because I still loved him and partly because people like Gavin are very skilled at making their emotional shifts sound like insight rather than drift. They do not say, "I am growing attached to someone else." They say, "I don't know who I am inside this version of my life anymore." If you are conscientious, you hesitate before calling that what it often is. Preemptive absolution. The other man, by the time I knew enough to name him as such, was named Cole. He worked in development consulting for one of Gavin's luxury projects. Older, financially polished, the sort of man who moved with just enough calm to make everybody else feel hurried by comparison. I met him once at an event and disliked him immediately in the way serious men often dislike certain types of confidence before they can rationally defend the instinct. Not because he was rude. Worse than rude. He was effortless in a way that required too much of the room. That sort of ease is often built on other people doing the admiring for free. Gavin described him first in the gently dismissive tone people use when they want to normalize their own interest before they are ready to examine it. Cole was too smooth. Cole had an expensive opinion about everything. Cole understood how to live without apologizing for wanting more. That last line stayed with me. Not because it proved anything. Because it revealed what kind of mythology Gavin had started to admire. I noticed the usual things after that. More evenings out. More unexplained energy after supposedly exhausting client dinners. More phone privacy, but not enough to look adolescent. Gavin was too practiced for that. He didn't snatch the device away. He simply repositioned it. Tilted the screen. Carried it room to room. Answered questions half a beat too carefully. Smiled at messages with a face I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. Nothing individually that would justify confrontation if I still believed myself responsible for preserving the dignity of the marriage before I had clear proof. That was my mistake. I thought dignity required waiting. Sometimes it only requires accuracy. The first time he asked for space, it was almost insultingly clean. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. I was chopping vegetables for dinner. He leaned against the island and said, "I think I need some space." I remember the sentence very clearly because of how prepared it sounded. Not frightened. Not guilty. Prepared. Which meant it had already lived in him long enough to become emotionally edited. I asked what he meant. He said he felt crowded by expectation. That he had been trying to keep showing up while feeling less and less like himself. That he needed room to think without every conversation becoming a referendum on the relationship. That line interested me because it was exactly backward. I was not making every conversation into a referendum. He was already living inside one and wanted me to stop noticing the voting pattern. I asked whether there was someone else. He paused briefly but clearly, then said, "No, that's not what this is." That was the first direct lie. I knew it almost immediately, though I did what I had done too many times already. I gave his answer the benefit of my own standards. I told myself that even if there was emotional drift elsewhere, maybe he had not yet crossed into something he would later have to name as betrayal. I wanted to be fair more than I wanted to be right. That is a dangerous instinct in the presence of self-serving ambiguity. He moved into a short-term rental downtown a week later. He called it temporary, reflective. He said he wanted space to think, to breathe, to stop injuring us both by forcing certainty before he had earned it. It was all beautifully phrased. That is one of the reasons people like Gavin succeed for so long. They do not lie crudely. They lie in language designed to make your own anger feel less evolved than their supposed confusion. And for a short while, I tried to honor the frame. I did not collapse. I did not chase him. I did not turn our mutual friends into jurors. I stayed measured. I checked in sparingly. I maintained the house. I kept my work steady. I even believed for about 2 weeks that maybe he was genuinely trying to think his way back toward some honest center. Then I found out where he really was. Not metaphorically. Practically. We shared a vehicle app because, like many long-married couples, we had never bothered separating certain logistical systems that trust had once made invisible. One Friday night, when he said he was spending the evening alone because he needed quiet from all the noise, his car sat overnight in the garage of a luxury condo building I knew belonged to Cole. Not once. Repeatedly. Then came the restaurant receipts, the weekend grocery charge for two, the rideshare pattern, the photos of a rooftop pool visible in the background of one of Gavin's social posts that matched Cole's building. He had not moved into his own temporary life to think. He had moved into someone else's. That is the thing about people who ask for space while already emotionally elsewhere. They often imagine distance itself will protect them from the moral weight of timing. As if moving out before confessing somehow makes the second relationship less real. It doesn't. It simply rearranges the cowardice. I did not confront him immediately. That mattered, because by then I understood the problem was not only that he had lied. It was that he had chosen the language of uncertainty to conceal the fact that he was already certain enough to relocate intimacy, but not honest enough to name it without cover. If I confronted him too early, he would still have control over tone. He would frame the move as accidental, evolving, emotionally complex. He would ask for patience inside a reality he had already chosen. Instead, I went quiet. Not passive. Quiet. I met with an attorney named Elaine Porter. Late 60s, exact, dry, unimpressed by moral theater once a timeline exists. I laid out the space conversation, the move, the condo garage records, the account trail, the overlap with Cole. She listened and then said something I have thought about many times since. He wasn't asking for space, she said. He was asking for transition without consequence. That sentence explained the entire marriage's final phase more clearly than any emotional conversation with Gavin ever had. He didn't want time to think. He wanted time to leave while keeping the dignity of uncertainty around him. He wanted to borrow my patience long enough to cross the emotional distance into another life without having to look like the kind of man who had already done so. Once I understood that, my silence changed character. I stopped calling, stopped checking in, stopped participating in conversations whose only real purpose was to let him keep narrating his departure as complexity rather than choice. I remained civil, responsible, exact. I paid the mortgage, managed the accounts, kept the house functional while we sorted legal structure. But I no longer offered him emotional shelter. That unsettled him more than anger would have. One evening he called and said, "You've become really cold." I said, "No. I've just stopped helping you call this uncertainty." He went quiet after that. Then tried the usual move. "It's more complicated than you think." I said, "No. It was more flattering than the truth." That was the first time I heard actual fear in his silence. Not fear of me. Fear of losing narrative control. The turning point came when he finally asked to meet in person. We sat across from each other in a small coffee shop neither of us liked but both considered neutral enough to avoid emotional nostalgia. He looked good in the way people often look good when they are still being held up by the early contrast of a new arrangement. Better rested. Brighter. Almost relieved. And yet I could see something in him that had not been there before too. The strain of keeping too many incompatible moral stories alive at once. He said he wanted to be honest. That line almost made me smile. He told me he had developed feelings for Cole. That he never intended for things to overlap the way they did. That moving out had not been about leaving for someone else, but about admitting to himself that our marriage had already become unlivable in ways he had been too afraid to say. Then he added what he clearly thought was the most defensible part. When I asked for space, I meant it. I just didn't know where it would lead. That was the moment I knew he still hadn't understood what offended me most. I said, "No. You knew where it was leading well enough to pack a bag and park in his building." He said nothing. Then I asked the question that mattered. When did you decide uncertainty sounded better than betrayal? That question changed the room, because it forced the issue away from desire and toward moral authorship. He was no longer being asked whom he loved or what he lacked or how trapped he had felt. He was being asked when he decided to narrate his choice in a way that preserved his innocence at my expense. He tried to answer with the usual language. Confusion. Feeling lost. Not wanting to hurt me. Trying to avoid something final until he understood himself. All of it smaller, weaker, and less intelligent once the structure was visible. I laid the printed timeline on the table. Garage entries. Account charges. Overlapping dates. The short-term rental lease followed by the condo access pattern. The messages from Cloud Backup where he told Cole he was finally almost free, before he had even finished telling me he needed time to think. He looked at the pages and went very still. That was the moment the truth was revealed. Not that there was another man. I already knew that. The deeper truth was that Gavin had not merely lied to avoid hurting me. He had lied to preserve his image as the thoughtful, emotionally responsible one while he exited the marriage under cover of ambiguity. He believed I would keep explaining, keep waiting, keep honoring the moral seriousness of his confusion long after he had privately stopped honoring the marriage. That was his arrogance. Not that he fell in love elsewhere. Not even that he moved in with someone else. The deeper arrogance was that he thought my patience belonged to him long enough to make the crossing feel cleaner. He said quietly, "I didn't think you'd see it this clearly." That sentence still stays with me, because it revealed how badly he had misread me. He knew my calm. He knew my caution. He knew my dislike of spectacle. He mistook all of that for limited vision. He thought because I moved slowly I saw slowly. People who live by emotional momentum often make that mistake. They cannot imagine that some men delay action not because they are confused, but because they are collecting the full shape of the truth before they act without apology. The divorce that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative, expensive, and ordinary in the cold, honest way adult endings usually are. House valuation. Asset division. Retirement accounts. Mutual friends selecting caution over courage. Gavin and Cole continued for a while, which again did not surprise me. Affairs that become relationships often survive long enough to prove that continuity and integrity are not the same thing. Whether they lasted or not eventually ceased to matter much to me. What mattered was what I learned about language. About how often space means cover. About how uncertainty gets used as moral camouflage by people who are already living inside choices they have not named. About how much damage can be done by a person who still wants to believe he is kind while making arrangements that only work if someone else remains patient enough to be used. A year later, after the divorce was final and the house had sold, Gavin said something to me while we were standing outside our accountant's office finishing the last tax paperwork. "I really did think you'd keep waiting." I looked at him and said, "That was the problem. You thought my patience was for your comfort instead of my own clarity." That, I think, is the message worth carrying from my story. People who ask for space are not always lying. Sometimes space is exactly what they need. But when someone asks for space while already relocating intimacy, already preparing another life, already softening the moral language of their departure, then space is not reflection. It is staging. It is the use of uncertainty as a costume. And if you are the one left behind in that script, the greatest mistake you can make is to keep honoring the costume after you have seen the man inside it. Real strength is not always loud. It does not always explode at the first clue. Sometimes it waits, watches, assembles the pattern, not because it is passive, because it understands consequence better than performance does. He asked for space. Then he moved in with her. The distance between those two facts told me everything I needed to know about which part was honest.